Hey there, what are you doing?
Just looking at birds.
Welcome. I'm your host, Chris. Join me as I interview avid birders to learn more about birds, birding, and those who love both. Today, my guest is Marcia Obara. With her birding origins in Buffalo and every New Year's Day spent birding the length of the Niagara River, she recently set her eyes on a big year. After retiring from 48 years as an RN, she traveled 22,000 solo miles in an RV across the country, visiting 25 different states. This year, she is attempting to bird and submit an eBird checklist every single day. That is quite a goal. It's good to have you on today.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
So last night you were out at the Saguaro National Park East, scouting an area that you'll be surveying soon. Were you able to add anything to yesterday's eBird checklist from there?
Yes, it was a pretty good area. I went to the Javelina picnic area, and I'd not been there before. And I had a western screech owl, which was really nice sitting in a saguaro. Had a bunch of black-throated sparrows.
Okay.
And I found them because they were singing, which I don't normally hear them.
Yeah.
Had brewer sparrows, which were also singing, and some beautiful curved-bill thrashers.
Oh.
So that was nice. And then on the way out, I saw a nice lesser nighthawk.
Oh.
And I thought it was a poor-will, and then I realized it had little white spots on the ends of its wings. So that was pretty cool. So
Nice.
And it was a nice scout, but none of the birds that I had targeted. I was targeting elf owls, which we're going to be surveying for next Friday night.
In the future, yes.
Yep.
Well, hopefully then you might see a few, huh?
Yes, that would be nice.
When you're out birding, what is one thing you have to remind yourself of?
To slow down and enjoy it. Because I like to walk fast. We always have a saying, if you hike, you don't bird. If you bird, you don't hike. And I like to walk fast. And so if I'm walking fast, I don't see things. So I have to consciously make myself slow down so that I can pay attention to what's in the trees, what's singing, what's on the ground, and all around me.
That's good advice. What do you enjoy most about birding?
Getting outside, especially with the quarantines and all the issues with COVID. It was a way for me to get out of the house and to get out and do things that didn't have anything to do, excuse me, with worrying about the quarantine or how I was going, how am I going to keep myself safe and not catch it until the vaccines were available. Sure. So, and when I worked, it was something that didn't have anything to do with hospitals. It was so remote from hospitals that it was a really nice break. It gave my brain a nice rest.
Yes. When you think back, when did you first take an interest in birding?
I know it was 1984 because I was in Algonquin Park. Okay. And I had, like everybody else, I pay attention to birds. I saw them flying around. And I knew robins, as they would run back and forth through my campground or whatever. But never really took the time to identify anything. And I heard a bird singing, even in the middle of the night. And my husband at the time said, I think we ought to go to the ranger station because the ranger can help you figure out what bird you're listening to. And the ranger said, I'm not going to help you. I'm going to give you a bird book. He said, you already have binoculars. I'm going to loan you a book. He said, and I'm going to tell you to look in the tops of the trees because that's where the bird is, the very tippy top. Well, I went back to the campsite. And there it was, sitting at the top of the tree. It was a red-eyed vireo. Oh. And they sing like little insane men. They're just full of hormones. And so sometimes they'll just burst forth in song at 4 o'clock in the morning because they're overcome with the need to attract ladies. And so that was my spark bird, was a red-eyed vireo. Okay. And then I had a friend at work who birded. And I said to her, do you mind if I come along? And she said, no. So that's how I ended up with the Buffalo Ornithological folks, because she was a member. Okay. And so I got a chance to bird with some of the best birders in that part of the state.
Wow. That was a great experience, a great way to kind of mentor you into it, huh?
Exactly right. Yep.
Going back even further, what is your earliest memory of a bird?
Robins, because I lived in the city. And that was the only bird. It was funny because somebody said something when I was growing up about possums. And I'd never seen one because I didn't live in a place where there were possums. I lived in a place where the only wildlife I saw was squirrels and robins. If there were other birds, I didn't recognize them. So that was what I grew up watching, was robins in my backyard.
Are you able to identify them now?
Yes.
Coming back to the present, or rather a few years ago, you went on quite an adventure for your big year. I'm sure there was a substantial amount of planning that preceded the trip, but after 22,000 miles, what were some things you learned along the way that you might do differently on another big year?
Oh, yeah, my rig was too large. I bought a rig that I thought was the right size. It was 23 feet self-contained.
Okay.
Because when it's raining, you don't want to pull in and then have to uncouple and hook up. I could just pull in, push my slide out, and go to bed. In retrospect, I should have had a smaller rig because I couldn't get it in and out of some parks.
Oh.
I also would have done a little bit more pre-planning as far as eBird checklists. I would have checked eBird and looked every morning, and I didn't. I kind of did it on the spur of the moment. And I spent most of my professional life doing a lot of planning. So one of the things I determined is when I retired, that was going to end. And so I sometimes didn't have any reservations out past 3 or 4 days.
Okay.
And I boondocked a lot. I stayed in people's driveways. I belonged to a program called Harvest Host, and I stayed in wineries and breweries and restaurants that let you park in their parking lot. So that was an interesting way to do it also. But I think I would have got a smaller rig. But I did have a good time. Oh, my goodness, I had a good time.
Speaking of those good times, I'm sure you've had many wonderful memories created. What are some that stick out right now?
I went to several festivals that I really enjoyed. I did one on Galveston Island called Featherfest.
Okay.
And the nice thing is somebody drives a van and helps you find things while you just sit and look out the window, which was quite a great way to do it. And then I did the biggest week of birding in Ohio, in McGee Marsh area. And that was 2 weeks of just an immersion in warblers. And then I took a pelagic trip, which is, for people who don't know what that is, that's out in the ocean.
Okay.
And I went to see puffins out on Egg Island off the coast of Maine. And my RV's been on 7 ferries.
Okay.
I accidentally drove over the George Washington Bridge in New York City. Because that's the way my GPS sent me, and because I didn't know where I was going, I didn't really have a choice. So I ended up on the top tier of the George Washington Bridge, hemmed in by semis.
Oh.
Yeah, in pouring rain. So it was an education, that's for sure.
Yes.
So I figure if I can drive an RV over the George Washington Bridge, I could pretty much do anything.
That's fair. When we stroll down memory lane, what is one thing you would share with others who might be looking to pursue a big year?
Try to plan it around. If you want to do an official big year, which mine couldn't be because an official big year starts on January 1. And I was retiring, and it turns out it was a good thing I did it the way I did it. I retired in the middle of March, and it started, I thought it would be good to start it on April Fool's Day. So plan. If you want to do an official big year, you have to plan it so that you start on January 1, which isn't easy. When I planned the trip, I planned it so that I was never going to encounter winter.
Okay.
Because that's not anything you want to try in a 23-foot self-contained motorhome.
No.
So plan your weather. Make sure that you know where you're going. Plan what you put in your itinerary. Know where you're, at least the general area where you're going, and plan festivals because they were great. Now, post-COVID, there might not be as many festivals, but plan hotspots. Look at eBird. I also planned an entire month with my family in New York. So build some fun in. I also did some things that weren't birding.
Yeah.
I went to a lobster festival. I mean, if there's going to be a festival, I'll go to it.
Along the way, yeah.
Yes. And make sure that you have all your birding resources, bird books, an extra pair of binoculars because sometimes they fall in the ocean, an extra camera if you have one because sometimes they fall in the ocean. I've run into people who lost their binoculars over the side of a ship because they didn't have their binocular strap on. I also learned a technique of threading my camera through my buttonhole of my shirt so that if I lean over, it'll just swing out. It won't fall. So plan what you're bringing and make sure that you have all the equipment that you need so that you're not trying to go to Walmart at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to pick something up that you forgot.
Sure. You mentioned wanting to check eBird checklists more. So it sounds like when you were planning, you planned around some big festivals, you planned around the winter, and then you planned maybe for some hot spots, but you weren't necessarily looking for these 15 birds today. You just knew this is a place where these are, and let me go there?
There was only 3 birds that were target birds for the whole trip.
Okay.
golden-cheeked warbler, black-headed vireo, because I was going to be passing through Texas at the exact time that they'd be arriving on migration, and it's the only place in the United States to see them for the most part. And then puffin.
Okay.
So those were the 3 of my target birds. I managed to add 23 life birds on the trip, and that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But no, I didn't. So people would say, what's your goal for how many species? I didn't have one. Because when you set goals, then you disappoint yourself when you don't get them. And I got the 3 target birds, and so that made me a happy little camper. That's for sure.
It's a good way to look at it, and a good way to plan for it.
Yep.
And I think when you get to those massive numbers for a goal, that can be a little consuming.
Yeah, you know, there's that fellow, Noah Stricker, and he did a big year. This is a sponsored big year. And he had a target of, I think, 5,500 birds, because it was a global.
Okay.
And he got to 6,050.
Oh, wow.
So he did pretty good for himself. But, you know, when you set such a high goal, sometimes you just can't do it.
Yeah.
Good thing I didn't, because COVID cut it short at the end. So.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you were able to see your 3 target birds.
Oh, me too. Me too. It was a lot of fun.
Leading bird walks probably encounter plenty of new birders and are often asked for advice. What is a piece of advice you would share with our listeners who are new to birding?
Don't be intimidated by people who are real good birders or seem to know all the birds or know all the songs. All of us started out not knowing a robin from a catbird. So you have to start with the birds in your yard. And I always tell people, learn the local birds. That way you'll know if anything rare shows up. And listen to the songs. And sometimes don't even use your binoculars. Just listen. You know, as we're sitting here, I can hear birds all around us in this beautiful park. And sometimes that's what you need to do. You need to just slow down and don't think that there's something wrong with you when you get it wrong. Lots of times, new birders are afraid to shout out what they think it is because they're going to get corrected. When I have a new birder and I do need to correct, I'll say, let's look at this bird. Let's talk about what that bird is and why it's what it is. So it's comes from my background of teaching, trying to help people to understand what they're looking at, talking about the bird parts. That's another thing in the field guides. There's a picture of a bird.
Sure.
Learn the parts of the bird. Learn where the undertail coverts are. Learn where the supercilium is, because somebody's eventually going to say, look, there's a white supercilium. I don't know a single person who's not a birder who knows where the heck a supercilium is. It's the little line over your eyebrow.
Okay.
So it's and birds have distinctive spots and, dots and streaks. And so you need to know the bird body as well. So that's always helpful. And then just understand how to use the field guide.
Okay.
Learning where the warblers are in the field guide so you can get to them quick.
What you mentioned at the beginning, that is how I began getting further into birding. Was I simply listened for birds that I didn't recognize, because in my backyard I knew, house finches, lesser goldfinches, mourning doves. And then when I heard a different sound, then I would start looking.
Yep.
When it comes to bird identification, you talk about the parts of a bird, and you mentioned a guide. What resource have you found the most useful?
I don't like carrying things with me. And so I don't carry a field guide with me at all. I have one on my phone. I actually have 3. I have a Sibley's regular field guide for the entire of North America.
Okay.
Then I have a guide to warblers and a guide to hummingbirds.
Okay.
And they're all on my phone. And the guide to warblers is very interesting because it's 3-dimensional. You can turn the bird and look underneath and look on top. Because warblers you often see from the bottom.
Yes.
As they're hopping around in a tree. So you look at their backside rather than their top side. So those are my favorite field guides. And I do have a couple printed ones that I carry in the car just in case I am absolutely stumped.
Yeah.
That's another thing for new birders. Sometimes you won't figure out what you're looking at. It's okay. You don't have to identify every bird you see.
Yes. I've had that when I was first trying to differentiate Cooper's hawks, Harris hawks, and these other hawks.
Yeah.
I had taken some good pictures, and I'm going between 3 different bird guides trying to figure out what part of the bird is different in these 2 to identify what it is.
Indeed.
What is something you've purchased for less than $100 that has had the largest impact on your birding experience?
It's a fishing jacket. It's a
Okay.
fishing vest,
Mm-hmm.
and it has like 30 pockets. And I can put my water in it, and if I carry a field guide fits in there. And then I can also put little snacks, and I can put my camera, and everything fits in it, so that if I want to go off and I don't want to carry everything with me, I can just take it off and set it aside.
Nice.
But it's very helpful to have everything in one place.
Sure.
And then I decorated it. I painted it on the back with a silhouette of a great blue heron.
Oh,
So it's just unique.
yes.
It's my favorite piece of equipment.
I think it makes things very convenient.
It does.
And it's, like you said, it is very unique.
Yep.
Now let's move on to our bird segment, where my guests have a chance to share a bit about a bird of their choice. And for this episode, Marcia has chosen the Vermilion Flycatcher. I often notice them alone, but have recently seen them in pairs in closer proximity to each other.
Yes, it's mating and nesting season. And as we were talking earlier, I saw them yesterday and the day before, and the males are flying up and doing their display. They make a chittery little call, and then they flutter their wings really stiffly. They're all red, and then they have little black wings. And so when they fly up, they're very noticeable.
Yes.
And so what you're looking for is you're looking for the female, because she's sitting in a tree watching him, because she's looking to see, does he have the right stuff? Don't ask me what they're looking for, but he's out there showing what he's got.
When you look for Vermilion flycatchers, where do you typically find them?
Usually in open areas where there's a lot of trees, because the Vermilion flycatchers like to fly out from a single perch. And you'll often, if you want to photograph Vermilion flycatchers, or any flycatcher for that matter, find their favorite perch. They'll always come back to it. They will constantly fly out, grab a bug or two. Sometimes you'll even see them fly out, land on the ground, eat a couple of bugs, and then fly up to the same perch. Sometimes they'll pick out a fence to sit on, but a lot of times it's a branch that sticks way out of a tree.
That is one thing I've noticed about Vermilion flycatchers is I never see them in the middle of a surface. I always see them on the edge, on the point, on the tip of something.
You'll often see birds at the edge of a habitat. So it's another bit of advice. If you're birding and you're about to walk from one habitat to another, pause for a second at the edge of the habitat, because a lot of times you won't flush things. If you enter a habitat, if you're going from the woods to like an open meadow, stay in the cover of the woods and look in the meadow before you walk out to the meadow. So it works for Vermilion flycatchers or anything. They like to stay at the edge of whatever habitat they like.
Oh. What other behaviors might you notice of a Vermilion flycatcher? Obviously, they have a very distinctive appearance.
Yes,
but
they do.
What other things might you notice and say, okay, I'm pretty sure that's a Vermilion flycatcher?
Well, it sits on the edge of it's little, and I always think of it as a little round, fluffy red ball. It's a very compact bird, not a lot of extra to it, and it fluffs up when it sits, and it darts out and darts back, darts out and darts back, and it sits in a distinctive way. It sits upright on branches rather than laying along the length of a branch. It'll sit up like a flycatcher. Because even though it doesn't look like the rest of the flycatchers, it is in fact a flycatcher and acts like one.
Okay. When we talked about this season, nesting, what are some things we might want to know about how Vermilion flycatchers nest?
Well, Vermilion flycatchers have brood parasitism.
Okay.
The female will mate with multiple males, and then she will go off and she'll lay her eggs in other Vermilion flycatcher nests. She's not like a brown-headed cowbird where it'll just randomly pick a nest and drop an egg in there. She puts them in other Vermilion flycatcher nests. I don't know what the advantage is, the breeding advantage is for that, other than to spread her genes around and to spread his genes around a little more.
Sure.
But they do that. They'll drop the eggs into other Vermilion flycatcher nests.
Do they look for an empty nest, or would they even drop their eggs in a nest that already had eggs?
Well, that's how they'll know that it's an occupied nest. They'll see eggs. So there might be two. She'll leave another one.
Oh.
Yeah, they have a creamy color. There are little speckles on them. They look a little bit camouflaged.
Okay.
And the nest is usually pretty well concealed. So it's much harder to find one of those than a verdant nest.
Okay.
The verdant nests are real. They're very obvious, where the Vermilion flycatchers not so much.
So it'll be further into the tree, maybe guarded by brush and such.
I can't say that I've seen more than one or two but I've seen lots of Verdin nests.
Yes, because they're further out on the branches, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, they are.
For this next question, I would like to touch on something that is very close to your heart, the impact we have on the avian world and their migration. Can you tell those of us who may not be very aware of this a little bit more about that?
Sure. I'm sure that even if you're not a birder, most people realize that many species of birds, and I would say all of them, but a good number of them, migrate. Mm-hmm. And they may migrate very long distances, like a bar-tailed godwit. I mean, goodness, that bird goes 23,000 miles. Wow. But other birds may only migrate 2 or 3 miles. Mm-hmm. But for those birds that come to us from the tropics, they spend the winter down in Mexico or down in South America, we have a great impact on their ability to move through our environment. We often think that a lot of the effect on migration and on bird populations, because we're experiencing tremendous decrease in all species of birds. And it's the number, not necessarily the species, but the number of birds within a species. Okay. And we, as North Americans, tend to say, well, if they wouldn't slash and burn their forests down in whatever country we're targeting at that point, sure. Then we'd have more birds to see. And we forget that we're knocking down forests and knocking down saguaros to build houses. And so our impact on bird migration is tremendous, especially if we're not cognizant when we build our gardens, when we build our landscaping around our homes to make it friendly for birds and for things like butterflies, because butterflies migrate as well. One of the areas that everybody likes to see alternative sources of energy. Sure. I particularly think that solar and wind power are very useful and probably the way we're going to need to go, especially in the Arizona part of the world. But when you place wind turbines in the wrong place, they can damage birds during migration. So there's a whole system where you can watch the birds migrating on the NOAA page and know when the birds are starting to migrate so that you can turn the turbines off at night and then let them come back on again in the morning when the birds are much less likely to be damaged by the spinning blades of the turbines. If you put the turbines along migration routes, that's really a good way to avoid damaging birds. And also large buildings in large cities that have lights on all night. The birds become very confused while they're migrating, and so one of the ways we can help them during migration is to shut the lights off. And the city of Toronto, I think it's called Lights Out Toronto, they do that now regularly because they've had such a big effort by a group in the city of Toronto to try to get them to turn those lights off. And so we can also do natural plantings in our yards, planting sage, planting trumpet flowers and things that are natural and normal and not so much grass. Planting trees that birds can use for shelter, for food. It's our mesquites that grow in our yards are full of bugs. Yeah. Great places for verdins. So that's one of the things that is I noticed. So I started to do a little bit of reading and a little bit of research, and that's when I discovered that those are some of the things we can do. Turning off the turbines, turning off the lights, and doing natural plantings in our yards.
For those of us with backyards where we want to pursue some natural planting, what do you think would be a good first step?
Tucson Audubon has a backyard habitat program, and you can contact them down at their headquarters down at on University Avenue. They could go visit their website, Tucson Audubon website, and take a look at their habitat program. They'll help you figure out what kind of birds you want to attract, what kind of plants you want to plant. Some people, I live in a place where I'm not allowed to have bird feeders. I live in an apartment. I'm not allowed to have bird feeders except for hummingbird feeders. So I have plants out there that will attract birds. So, and I don't use a hummingbird feeder either. I have hummingbird plants on my patio. That way I don't have to worry if I go out of town. I have the little automatic waterers, and it'll water and it'll take care of it for me, and it'll take care of my hummingbirds at the same time.
That's a good way to address that.
Yep.
So finally, I have one more question.
Sure.
One of the things that stuck out to me as I read about your participation with the Tucson Audubon Society was that you led a number of field trips for those with mobility concerns and the need for enhanced accessibility. When reading more about this, I came across the term birdability. Can you define birdability for those of us who are unfamiliar with the term?
Oh, sure. Birdability addresses the idea that everyone should have the ability to bird, regardless of any physical issues you might have, presence of a wheelchair, the presence of crutches, prosthetic limbs, folks who are blind. And so birdability addresses all of those things. There's even some birdability programs for folks with things like autism. So the birdability program came about because a lady she was a paraplegic and confined to a wheelchair and was having a terrible time finding birding groups where she was welcome. Well, part of it is just, you know what, just open your heart and invite the people along and deal with the issues when they come up. So what I do is I go out and I visit various areas around Tucson and south and north of here.
Sure.
Looking for parking that's accessible for folks that have wheelchairs. Then they have the ramps that have to come out. So you have to have, just because there's a handicapped decal on the parking space doesn't mean that a person with a mobility accessible van or car is going to have enough room to get in and out and be able to get their wheelchair out down the ramp. And also, what's the grade? I mean, is it a real steep grade of the trail? And is the trail paved? So far, I don't take folks out on unpaved areas, although I did have a group last time, and we were birding at a wastewater treatment plant on Houghton Road, and they decided that they wanted to go on the gravel. I'm like, okay, we can. If you can maneuver your wheelchairs on gravel, that's okay with me. So we did, and we didn't have any problems. So it's a matter of letting them be as adventurous as they feel they're safe to do. So my job is to find them birds, and many of them are new birders, as we talked about before. So sometimes they don't know the families, they don't understand how birding taxonomy works, and so a lot of it is me explaining what a bird looks like, how it sits in the tree. The first time I had somebody ask me that, they said, "What makes it a sparrow?" And I thought, I think I should probably have an answer ready for that. And so that's what I do when I take the birdability groups out. There's a number of trails and a number of areas in the city of Tucson that are completely accessible to anyone who might have mobility issues. And so we advertise them. Right now, we're only allowing 5 people on a field trip. I'll let 6 if it's somebody that needs somebody accompanying them. We welcome service dogs, and accompanying family members are fine as long as everybody wears a mask. So our next trip is McDonald Park. They have a wonderful paved trail that goes for almost a mile with not very much grade changes, not a lot. So I don't have to worry about people losing control of wheelchairs or anything going down steep
inclines or declines.
But so far we've had a good time, and I've really enjoyed meeting them and enjoyed interacting with them. They're a fun bunch.
So it sounds like there's a balance of preparation where you scout out the area, and then a balance of making them aware of the terrain challenges, and then giving them the option to, as you said, be more adventurous.
Yes. When I go out, I usually go once for the initial scouting, then I go a second time to bird, and then I go, the trip is next Thursday, so I'll go on Wednesday or Tuesday, and I'll scout out what birds are there. So that if I can find a nest or something, that's always a bonus. To show them a verdin nest or show them a nice little hummingbird nest. So I do some of that as well. And then that way I can also look to see if maybe somebody's like taking a big chunk of concrete out because they're about to renovate the path or something. So to make sure that somebody hasn't made a big change to what I think is a nice 1 mile, and we get halfway around and go, "Oop, nope, not going any further on this one." Can't cross here.
As fellow birders, what can we do to contribute to birdability?
There's a birdability.org website, and it asks for feedback from birders of all abilities. In people who are experienced birders, people who are accessibility challenged, and you can grade different parks and trails based on criteria that they have set up.
Okay.
And so you can go ahead and add your sightings for different areas and suggest new places.
Okay.
Yep, you can do that. Or you can just let your local Audubon folks know that you'd like to try to do a birdability program in your area. There's one at the Rio Grande Valley Birding Festival. They have every day a birdability walk
Okay.
that one of their leaders leads, and she does it every single day for the festival.
That's great.
Yep.
So it sounds very similar to the scouting you do, except anyone can do that. Where we
Correct.
could go, and the website would help us get an idea of what to pay attention to, since some of us may not know what to look for.
It actually gives you all the criteria.
Okay.
What you should look for. Look, for the different inclines. One of the things that I've become very aware of is parking and how rude non-handicapped people can be. You know the little hash marks next to a handicapped spot?
Yes.
That means don't park there because that's for their ramp. And there's a picture that circulates on Facebook periodically of a little boy in a wheelchair, and he's looking at his car because he can't get in because a person has parked too close and his ramp won't come out. So they either have to go look for the person who's parked in a rude manner or wait until that person comes back. So watch where you're parking.
So stay clear of those lines.
Stay clear of those little hash marks. They're there for a reason.
That's good for those of us who may not know what that is for.
Yes.
I'd like to thank Marcia for joining us today, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow or subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening to this episode from. You can visit lookingatbirds.com for show notes, a transcript of the episode, and pictures of the Vermilion Flycatcher taken by Marcia, maybe a few from her new camera. Until next time, keep looking at birds.